28 July on global megatrends. So keep an eye on your inboxes for the invite to register, which should be coming through in the next week or so. It's really wonderful to see so many familiar names and organisations joining us today. A very big thank you on behalf of my fellow RIMS directors for your continued support. And it's also great to see so many new names registering today. A very big welcome to RIMS. We hope you gained value from today's session and we hope to see you again. Now, since there are so many first-timers joining us today, I thought I'd give you a very quick overview of who we are and what our purpose is before handing over to our esteemed panel of speakers. So we are RIMS, NZ and PI, the New Zealand and Pacific Islands chapter of the Global Risk Management Society, comprising more than 10,000 members across 60 different countries. So it's a really incredible network of risk professionals delivering relevant and innovative thought leadership and content to our global risk community. The New Zealand and Pacific Islands chapter was formed about 18 months ago. We broke away from the Australasian chapter to enable a greater focus on our very own special region. Our purpose as a chapter is to drive connection for innovative thinking and risk management, contributing to building resilience and diversity, and allowing New Zealand and the Pacific Islands to thrive in a dynamic world. We do this by delivering educational, networking and mentoring opportunities and support to New Zealand's risk professionals through a series of educational events such as this one today. We have an annual summit, we host risk roundtables on specialised topics, and we have a mentoring program. We're currently exploring how we can connect with our members and community in a different way as a result of the unusual times that we find ourselves in, to deliver content and support to a wider network than our traditional in-person events. We've got a few pretty cool ideas, so we'll hopefully be able to share those with you shortly. As mentioned, we have a mentoring program which has grown to over 150 participants. If you'd like to take part either as a mentor or a mentee, please do get in touch as we'd love to have you involved. Our contact details should be on the screen. We'll share these with you after the webinar as well, together with the slides from today's presentations actually. So just bear that in mind, there's no need to take screenshots or photos of your screen, etc. We will share the slides. Before I hand over to Matt Preece, our facilitator for today, I'd like to extend a massive thank you, as always, to our sponsors for their ongoing support. Kpmg, AIG, Allianz, Marsh, ACC and Willis Towers Watson. We are so grateful for your continued commitment to RIMS, so a very big thank you from all of the directors. Right, that's enough from me. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Matt Preece, Senior Manager Forensics at Kpmg, who is going to host the session today. Matt has 23 years experience as a forensic investigator with a specialisation in fraud and corruption investigations. Prior to joining Kpmg, Matt was a detective with the New Zealand Police and then an investigator with the Serious Fraud Office. He's carried out investigations for civil litigation, criminal prosecutions and regulatory proceedings in many sectors, including central and local government, finance, insurance, health, education and Māori, and is expertly placed to lead our webinar today. Thank you everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's session. And before I go, note that you can submit any questions for panellists through the Zoom chat function, which will then be addressed during the panel discussion. So Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thanks Teresa. Trial number one, I unmuted myself. Got that done. Yeah, look, on behalf of Kpmg, thank you for the opportunity to be involved in the webinar. I'm very pleased to be a sponsor of RIMS. It's great to have an opportunity to bring the risk community together to discuss the issues that we all face. And I think we're very lucky today with the calibre of the speakers that we've got with Graham, Campbell and David, some of the industry leaders really in the sort of fraud corruption space, and particularly with David and his aftercare with the victims of fraud and corruption. Look, so I'll introduce each speaker, give a quick bio of them before they give the presentation, So the first one we have Graham Gill. So Graham leads the evaluation and intelligence team at the Serious Fraud Office. This team is responsible for evaluating all the complaints and referrals that come into the SFO and determining which matters are going to progress to investigation. Graham also leads the business services within the SFO, which manage the agency's finance, communication, IT systems and human resources. And before joining the SFO, Graham worked for the Commerce Commission, where he was a manager in the competition branch. And prior to that, Graham was a detective sergeant with the police in both Wellington and Auckland. Graham's also spent time working across Asia as a human resources manager for a Sydney-based tech company. Graham has a Bachelor of Business Studies from Massey University and a postgraduate qualification from the University of Auckland. So over to you, Graham.
So I failed the first test and forgot to unmute. Thank you very much, Matt and Rims, for having me here today. I wonder if you could just click to the first slide. Yeah, if you could just click down through all the points, that would be good. Look, the SFO continues to see employee thefts, corrupt actions by employees, both in the public and private sector. Essentially, what do we expect to see? Largely a lot of the same, to be honest, in most areas. Around 40% of our investigations are what we call corruption, taking advantage of organisational position for private benefit. So those involve things such as alleged conflicts of interest in awarding contracts, involvement in companies contracting to their employer, sometimes with a financial benefit for the individual, and just generally working against the best interests of the organisation. I am just going to make some reference to a recent bribery and corruption survey that was undertaken by one of the other CA firms, so apologies to Kpmg. But I think it's relevant to in the risk space. So 35% of participants in that survey reported suffering a bribery and corruption incident, 17% in the last 12 months, and 69% perceived bribery and corruption to be a risk to their organisation. You're more worried about being on the demand side, so being corrupted by a third party rather than an employee instigating the corrupt scheme. Some of our cases are kind of relevant to that observation, and really it's a fine line between the supply and demand sides of the equation. A guy by the name of Simon Hall was prosecuted by the SFO after accepting kickbacks offered by importers of goods he was selling for Fisher and Paykel, one of New Zealand's biggest corruption cases, Auckland Transport, in which it was really unclear who was actually the instigator and who was the follower. So I think it's probably a slightly artificial delineation to make, and I don't think you should probably focus on that terribly much. It's important to kind of note, and this is one of the things that we talk about all the time, that corruption is not simply an overseas issue. Initially corrupt acts can occur quickly, fly under the radar, but more often a single act is a catalyst for persistent and more pernicious forms of offending. So a recent case, Racilla and Shand, which concluded in the High Court, I think recently, involved a kickback being paid for the provision of goods to Auckland Council. A single act was identified early, and I have to say that Auckland Council did really well to detect it, but there was evidence of an attempt by the supplier or one of the offenders to continue that corrupt relationship into another place of employment. Now, respondents to that survey I mentioned were confident in the effectiveness of their own organisation's preventative controls. While that's really positive, the caveat may be that nearly a third of all respondents did not have a schedule of work to manage the risk of bribery and corruption. So the question really for executives is, how confident are you that your controls match your organisation's specific risks? Now, although kind of about 2/3 of organisations are confident in their due diligence of staff, confidence drops off when you start talking about third parties, suppliers, and significantly for subcontractors and agents. And this kind of really matches with our experience, in which we find often, in particular government agencies, their contracts with external suppliers really can lack specificity about deliverables, audit and reporting processes, and the ability to claw back monies in the event of, I guess, fraud, error, or just general confusion or non-delivery. In cases we have really struggled to prove a fraud and actually haven't proceeded with cases because there's uncertainty about the representations being made and the actual contractual arrangements. So one of the things that we clearly say to people is, look, you need to make sure you have in place clear contracts. It's really clear about deliverables and reporting and auditing processes. And no, the slide shouldn't be changing quite at the moment. So internal culture is a key to tackling bribery and corruption. Most feedback suggests that strong leadership commitment is critical, and a lot of people talk about the tone at the top. However, what we often talk about is in fact the mood in the middle. What you find is executives can be quite detached from the mood in the organisation. And in any organisation, it's actually the middle managers who keep the organisation running and really set the tone. So you need to make sure that those middle managers, and they can be risk people, they can be marketing people, they can be whoever, are making sure that there are strong messages around bribery and corruption. Getting buy-in at a senior level can be challenging for some organisations. We accept that. Nothing shook up the public sector, like the Joanne Harrison case. So just touching on those kind of employee thefts, we see a lot of slack controls and oversight. We've got a recent prosecution in the defence space where an employee stole money from social clubs. There were non-public funds. There was a lack of segregation of duties. No review, red flags weren't followed up, really clear messages there and learnings. A second case involves a DHB, which is still before the court. However, an employee, it's alleged, diverted somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million to their own bank accounts. Payments were being made in cash and by creating false invoices. There was no oversight of activities, and that included oversight of cash payments. Computer systems could be changed without oversight or authority, and didn't actually create logs of all of those changes. So just change the next slide, please. So again, this is from that other survey, but it touches on things that we see in the SFO around the concerns for companies and how they translate into fraud. Some of these things on that slide, such as conflicts of interest, are not actually crimes. However, as in the Auckland Transport case, you can see how a non-declaration of a conflict of interest slid into one of the largest corruption cases in New Zealand. We see it regularly, conflicts of interest not being managed properly. We had a recent case where we actually made some inquiries about a potential conflict of interest because it was raised by a third party. We were assured that it was being managed appropriately. A year later, the organisation came back to us and reported that actually that person was involved in corruption and fraud and taking kickbacks. So our general view is that you actually can't manage your way out of conflicts of interest. You simply need to exclude that particular person from the process. It may be difficult, but it's really crucial to the transparency and transparency of processes and decision making. If you click onto the next slide, please. So this is our own work. It kind of shows, is it a slippery slope? Is there a cause and effect? People can fall into fraudulent or corrupt behaviour either through starting out at the bottom of the spectrum and slowly working their way up. There insufficient controls prevent people from detecting that fraud, or in some cases people jump in right at the top and take advantage of lax controls and commit a fraud. So if you could change the slide, please. So I guess, what are the likely impacts of COVID-19, and what are we going to see? If you could change the slide, please. Look, local and international experience is that following a significant economic downturn, there's an increase in serious and complex fraud. This is for a number of reasons. Fraudulent behaviour is revealed as companies go out of business. Investors seek to extract their investments, in response to financial circumstances. The tolerance for previously accepted behaviour is reduced. During the GFC, New Zealand saw a large number of the finance companies collapse. The SFO investigated 16 of those, resulting in about 29 individuals being prosecuted. So New Zealand is not new to that kind of behaviour. What we see in disaster recovery, which is usually accompanied with unprecedented levels of investment and often lower levels of controls, is that it creates opportunities for large-scale fraud. Following the Canterbury earthquake, SFO investigated about 8 cases worth about $257 million in alleged fraud. I should say we didn't prosecute them for a number of factors, such as lack of paperwork, contracts, aftershocks and things that made it really difficult to prove the actual frauds. But it was clear that there was behaviour going on that was fraudulent in nature. And look, importantly, also following the Canterbury earthquake, the SFOs investigated and prosecuted 2 large-scale Ponzi schemes based in Canterbury, fraud values of about 31 million. Those schemes targeted investors who were looking for non-property investments following the loss of value in real estate market following the earthquakes. It's kind of fairly consistent with our experience of investors seeking higher returns for their investments while not appreciating the accompanying risk, as was the case in the finance company where people were chasing interest rates of, say, 9, 10, 15% without appreciating the actual risk. So our international counterparts estimate that between 0.5% and 4% of government spending is lost to fraud and error. It's generally accepted, as I said, being higher following natural disasters. Anywhere in the region of 10 to 15% of disaster recovery fraud funding is lost to fraud. That might be lower in New Zealand with our kind of cultural norms and our statutory frameworks, but it's probably fair to say that we will lose money to fraud and error. And I do say error because that's kind of wasted, things being spent in the wrong way. So one thing also to consider is that the lockdown period has led to significant change in how people work. Being able to work from home, periods of uncertainty. Some of those changes are here for quite a while. So you should consider the risks that come from those new approaches. Whether the new ways of working increase the opportunities for fraud, and whether the economic uncertainty has increased pressure and the ability to rationalise fraudulent or corrupt acts. So I guess what we're saying is you need to understand your employees. Things will have changed for them, which may create a fraud, corruption, or even just a general security risk. So look, I'll just conclude with a couple of comments and just say, look, Firstly, I should just put a plug in for the SFO. We've received funding from the government to lead public sector response to prevention of financial crime targeting COVID-19 funds and more widely. So you will see us, particularly in the public sector, a little bit more active in that space. We are also following on from our the review of the SFO last year, furthering a national financial crime and corruption strategy with police and justice, and that will incorporate both the public and private sectors. So there'll be a lot of activity in that space, and it is a priority for justice. But I just wanted to kind of conclude with a comment from a review of the SFO last year, which is our performance improvement framework, which noted New Zealand's reputation as a high trust, corruption-free society is at risk. Our apparent complacency and ambivalence towards the risk of corruption and fraud in both the public and private sectors not only creates increased financial risk to individual businesses, but also the risk to our international reputation and economy. So regardless of what's happening with COVID-19, there is a risk there, and both the public and private sector benefit from our international relationships. So we all need to work together to make sure that we make sure we stay as clean and corruption and fraud free as we possibly can. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. There's some very interesting points raised there, which I'm sure we will cover in more detail in our Q&A session to come. So our second speaker, Campbell McKenzie, is a director at the Incident Response Solutions Limited. Campbell is a forensic technology expert and cyber security consultant. In January 2007, he founded Incident Response Solutions, a specialty forensic and cyber security business. Campbell was previously a director at PwC New Zealand for 12 years, where he led the National Forensic Technology Practice and the Auckland Cyber Security Practice. Prior to PwC, Campbell was a founding member of the New Zealand Police Electronic Crime Laboratory. Campbell has worked on a wide range of forensic and cyber matters for both private and public sectors, including forensic technology, cyber security, and whistleblower disclosures. So I'll hand over to Campbell for our second session.
Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. And just one clarification there, it was January 2019 I started out. However, it certainly feels like a lot longer than a year and a half. It's been a busy couple of years. So thank you, and thank you, RIMS, for the opportunity. I just wanted to start out with a couple of public service announcements. Firstly, this week we celebrated World Whistleblowing Day. And secondly, today, Chris Hipkins has released the Protected Disclosures, which is now called the Protection of Whistleblowers Bill, which is going to replace the Protected Disclosures Act 2000. So obviously it's long overdue. We all welcome this change to New Zealand, which is essentially going to give greater provisions to the protection of whistleblowers and obviously hopefully encourage more people to come forward. So you can see there I've got a bit of a combination of services that we provide in our business. It's a mixture between whistleblowers and cyber and forensic. I am fortunate enough to work with a number of ex-police officers who run the whistleblowing lines. And of course, a lot of my focus is on the forensic technology side of incidents. And certainly at the moment, we're seeing a lot of, for example, business email compromises come through. So I've mainly been asked today to talk about what to do to both help identify a fraud and what to do once you actually have one. One point I would note out is that in the world of cyber, it's often hard to actually find who did it. But I just saw the US Department of Justice released last week that they have got a successful guilty plea from a Nigerian group that took about $11 million from an unsuspecting company up in America. So that's great to see. Next slide, please. So it's always good to draw on some surveys, and now that I don't work for one of the big four, I don't help publish these anymore, so I'm drawing on the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and I've been involved in doing surveys now for around about 12 years, in New Zealand in particular. And what I have to say is the results in this one, which is a global one, very much reflects what has been happening in and around New Zealand as well. But this year's report, which just came out in the last few months, drew on 2,500 cases. It involved 125 countries, and it comprised a total loss of over $3.6 billion. Next slide, please. It's always good to start off by having a look at the profile of a typical fraudster. And in a nutshell, if you look at this graphic here, the longer the tenure, the bigger the fraud. Males are the worst offenders by around about an extra 100% than females. You've got a better chance at ripping off your employers if you have a degree. And it seems that the older we get, the more greedy we are when it comes to fraud. Graham mentioned before as well about what happened during the GFC. I remember being part of a publication called Fraud in a Downturn. We saw a lag, probably of about 2 years before things actually started coming across our desks that we worked on. I think the same thing will happen post-COVID as well. But one thing I would have to say is I'm already starting to see an increase in internal frauds, particularly the theft of confidential information. Next slide, please. Okay, I found this one a particularly interesting slide because you can see there the two on the left deal with physical documents when it comes to the methods used by fraudsters, and the ones on the right, obviously in the electronic world. According to CERT New Zealand, which is the New Zealand government agency that deals with such matters, once you do manage to get access to someone's email account, the most common MO is false invoicing. So this slide indeed reflects those statistics. And there's several ways that the fraudsters may actually target organisations. They might target them by actually sitting on the email account, conducting reconnaissance, finding out which invoices they want to change, or secondly, they might just forward on all emails to their own account and wait for the big invoice to come through. A couple of years ago in New Zealand, it was quite widely reported that the building industry was being targeted. Right now, there was a report last week about a mortgage broker being targeted. Obviously, a lot of people have been waiting to buy and sell their houses during the lockdown, and in the rush to go ahead and complete those transactions, obviously the fraudsters are hoping that people aren't paying 100% attention to either the email address it's coming from, which may be fake, or indeed the invoice itself. But of course, like with all good accounting practices and internal controls, if someone is asking to change a bank account, there's a number of hard and fast steps that you should be following. I'd also just like to mention there's an excellent report from the CANS, Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand, called Cyber and the CFO. It's a fairly long report, probably about 80 pages long. It's published last year, and it includes a very detailed description of the types of frauds that are targeted towards the finance function. So you'd be well placed to have your teams read through at least that section of the report so they're aware of the types of frauds they may be targeted with, and they can put the protections in place. Next slide, please. So, how are frauds most commonly detected, or any form of misconduct for that matter? So again, I mentioned about being involved in a number of surveys. This slide very much reflects what I've seen over the last decade, and that tips or whistleblowing lines are by far the most common way in which frauds are detected. With the reform to the Protected Disclosures Act as well, there will be additional requirements on organisations from a reporting point of view. Over on the right-hand side there, you can see that half of such tips come from internal, which means obviously half are external as well. So currently the Act does cover people that are actually outside of the employee definition, but it'll be interesting to see exactly where the Act lands as to who actually may be covered by way of a protected disclosure. Next slide, please. So this stuff should really go without saying, and that the best form of detection is by way of conducting fraud awareness training, making sure your employees are aware of the latest tips, techniques and procedures used by fraudsters. And that obviously doesn't include the traditional internal means, but obviously those used by cyber attackers. They are getting more and more sophisticated, very, very convincing if you sit down and actually have a look at some of these attacks that are occurring. But also what's interesting to see is that from the tip-off mechanisms, there's 4 traditional channels being post, email, website, and phone. Phone still does seem to be a common one. A lot of people do like to pick up and actually talk to people and tell them about what occurred. And Graham mentioned before about the Auckland transport case, for example. So, you know, if you are involved in such a matter like that, who can the people contact? What are the mechanisms and what are their preferred options? So it's always good to think about those channels. Next slide, please. So once you've detected a fraud, what actually happens in the organisation? So drawing on this research, 80% face some sort of discipline, but obviously that leaves a big gap with another 20% what actually happened to them. And if you can flick on to the next slide as well. And a final slide from the what do you do once you occur, termination. Obviously a very large number there. I was interested to read some of the permitted or required resignation type scenarios. And obviously there's a small percentage there which actually seem to have no punishment as well. Okay, and just I've got 2 more slides which I'll quickly glance past, but you may be interested in reading further in the survey. So civil litigation is the first one, and the next one is from a criminal perspective. I was quite surprised by these statistics actually, especially the 21% resulted in judgment for the perpetrator. So please do read more on that if you're interested. But if you compare those statistics with the next slide, this is far more what I'd expect to see. A lot of those have been referred to law enforcement, and I'd always encourage cases to be referred to the correct the correct enforcement body. Graham obviously talked about the types of cases the SFO worked on, but as long as you're taking it to one location, I'm sure they'll help you get to the right location. But I think the best statistic there is that only 2% of fraudsters were acquitted once they have been prosecuted. Okay, moving on, please. I've drawn from the Kpmg fraud barometer, which was fairly recently produced. I think it's good to see some New Zealand statistics in amongst a presentation such as this roundtable. Perhaps I won't say anything to this, but I'll invite Matthew once we all have our microphones turned back on to talk to some of the findings that they have had in New Zealand. And just before I finish up, I'm going to do a quick switch to focus on the cyber area and what you can do. So next slide, please. You might be reading a lot at the moment in the media about what's happening in the world of cyber and attackers. And we're talking about fraud here, but there can be a number of different impacts to an organisation which isn't just an invoice fraud. So, for example, ransomware, extortion, and so on and so forth. This comes from Lockheed Martin, who I trust being an aircraft manufacturer, and they have mapped out a traditional kill chain into the world of cyber. But the key thing being here is I mentioned organised crime groups are very sophisticated, they're very well funded. So the reconnaissance phase of what might occur may absolutely astound you, but from the time that when someone in your organisation gets a phishing email, please enter your details to receive this file, and then someone who shouldn't be getting access to that account does, it might be anywhere between 1 day, but potentially up to 6 months before they actually take their actions on objectives, which is point number 7 there, which is where they're basically pulling the trigger and asking someone to pay money into the different account. That is because they're essentially trawling through your online email accounts, looking for the best opportunity that they think they can defraud someone. Fortunately, with good training, a lot of people pick up on this stuff, but don't be surprised by how sophisticated these people are and the extents they go to fool people. I've actually chucked up a couple of videos that are worthwhile watching on my YouTube channel, which are produced by cyber insurance companies and security vendors, and it just shows you how convincing some of these emails do appear. And one final statistic is on the next slide, is from our New Zealand government agency, CERT New Zealand. As you can see on the left-hand side there, phishing and credential harvesting, which is essentially the stealing of people's online logons and passwords, is by far the biggest incidence that's reported to CERT-NZ. Also just remembering and bearing in mind that a lot of these are home users as well. But scams and fraud feature very highly, of course, as well. And just as a final takeaway, I'm going to share with you some security measures and training that you can take away to your organisation. I think you should always start with a framework. If you don't have one in place already, probably one of the best places to turn to is the Nist Csf. So that is the US Government National Institute of Standards and Technology Cyber Security Framework. And it's a very simple process and free process that you can follow your current cyber state, and you can map out where you want to be in future and work out the steps you're going to have to take to reduce your risks. And you can overlay that with something like the CIS, the Centre for Internet Security Controls, which is a set of 20 basic controls where things like asset management, identity and access management, physical controls, and so on and so forth. You can assess those and again take steps to improve them. If either of those are perhaps too complicated, too complex and intense for your organisation, again, CERT-NZ has a simpler list of just 10 top controls, and you'll be well placed to follow those. Number one being make sure you take backups. So when you hear about ransomware attacks and the damage that it causes organisations, most people don't want to have to pay a very large ransom, and they'd rather restore from the backup. Unfortunately, organisations still aren't undertaking backups as much as they should. But the one thing I would strongly urge everyone here to make sure they have is a full backup of their entire IT data they may need to recover. And it should be on a hard drive, which is not on the network, placed in a safe somewhere. That is the best form of data protection you can have. And I've put 4 bullet points there as far as business email compromise. The key thing being, as it has been for about the last 20 years, if you've got two-factor authentication you should turn on, you should do so. I had two-factor authentication with my bank back in, I think 2002 it was. So if it's there, turn it on. For every $1 spent on security, you should spend 80 cents on user training. Improve your invoice verification processes and share those processes with your clients. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Campbell. Again, very interesting and very timely, I think, with a couple of the events that have occurred in New Zealand over the last week or two. Very interesting article in the NBR this morning on the Lion cyber attack, which I'm sure everyone would be interested in having a quick look at. Gives an invaluable insight into how these cyber attackers operate. Yes, quite astonishing. And also very kind of you to mention the Kpmg fraud barometer. I think it's a very useful snapshot of fraud that's occurred in New Zealand, specifically over it's over a 6-month period that we're reporting on. So our previous publication was prior to COVID, so it'll be very interesting to see what findings we have in our next edition of the fraud barometer. Our third speaker today, David Lacy, I should say Professor David Lacy, is the Managing Director of ID Care. David was the founder of ID Care. He's held senior executive roles across government and industry within cyber security, law enforcement and national security. He advises governments and corporates on integrating customer-centric identity and cyber security response capabilities. David has held numerous board roles in commercial and not-for-profit organisations and is an active member of government and industry audit and risk committees. He holds undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in accounting and information systems, management and justice, is a chartered accountant and has published widely on identity and cybercrime. He is recognised as a global leader in identity and cybersecurity and is frequently engaged as an expert media commentator, keynote speaker and independent director and board member. So thank you very much. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kerry, Rims, and Matt for the introduction. I guess our intersection with this particular topic is a slightly nuanced one. A lot of the fraud and corruption reports and data is very much focused on the size of losses and rarely touch on the size of information exposure, which is where we tend to play a much more prominent role once corrupt acts occur, particularly those that might be enabled through cyber means. We deal with the fallout of those exposures for impacted people with ID Care. So, Care, if you just click a few times on that slide, we'll just give a bit of a background to ID Care. We are a registered Australian not-for-profit and charity, and our services extend across to the New Zealand community. We have offices now in Napier, as well as here on the Sunshine Coast in the Queensland bubble that it is. We were launched in 2014 in Australia, in 2015 with Minister Adams in New Zealand. We've had a very busy period of time, and since, I guess, the lockdown measures on both sides of the Tasman in March, the community demand for ID Care services has increased around 40%. And a lot of that is to do with COVID-related reactions and impacts. Certainly there's a degree of scam activity. We're seeing on this side of the Tasman, people's superannuation is being accessed by organised crime as a result of government measures and incentives that are inspiring such behaviours. But it's more than that. We've seen, I guess, for a period in March, in the early days of lockdown, an escalation in telephone and email scams, where community members, and SMS scams, where community members were doing the right thing and ignoring them and calling them out. And then when particular government incentives were offered and the crooks were getting in there, legitimate SMS messages were being sent as control measures to legitimate customers, and they were ignoring those warnings, thinking that they were scams. So it's had this kind of interesting behavioural impact on consumer reactions to fraud-related controls. So it is very, very, very busy times for us. Most of the big data breaches that you'll hear about, we're involved up to our eyeballs with. And mostly that's around assisting organisations understanding, well, what is the impact to the people that have had their data exposed in these events, and what are some really practical and innovative response measures that can be taken to protect those impacted people. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. Thanks, Kerry. Our mission really is to provide world's best practice benevolent relief to victims of identity and cybercrimes and all its weird forms and shapes that it takes. We do that through providing case management support that can be anonymous, but if a victim wants us to act on their behalf for whatever reason, they may not have the capacity to respond, then obviously we'll need to know a bit more about them. But for the most part, we don't need to know anything about the people we help. And we provide that in a number of ways, but principally through a telephone engagement. Thanks, Gary. The counselling approach that we take in ID Care, or the case management approach, is knowledge-based counselling. So for most customers or employees that are impacted by individuals that commit corrupt acts, such as harvesting of their personal information to either commit a financial deception or indeed to perpetrate other deceptive acts, such as selling that data, we provide the case management support in a way that fills the knowledge gap that victim often has. So if you've ever been notified of a data breach and you're reading that letter and it says that your IR number or your NZTA license or your passport's been compromised, for a lot of people, the questions in their minds are, well, what does it actually mean for me? What are my risks? And what are the things that need to be done to protect me? So there's a lot of questions that are asked, and a key part of the community and charitable work that we do is filling that gap in that knowledge. And that's a very important part of the counselling or behavioural approach that we have. It's not the adage that profit shared, profit halved. In our world, knowledge shared, knowledge doubled. And that's the approach that we take. It also means that we're incredibly busy in keeping up to date with what the most current response journeys and plans are. And we don't mean, shred your documents and lock your letterbox and, change your passwords. We mean if this particular organisation says you have this particular account, what is the specific response you need to consider? So it's a very, very fine level of detail that we need to get to in our response planning that we test quite regularly. Thanks, Kerry. Here's the broad church of why people knock on our door. And I guess worryingly so, there are those that come to us in increasing numbers that are knocking on our door because they have no idea how their information was stolen or compromised. And in part, that will be because of corrupt acts. So if you're an individual or a consumer that's in that position and you're starting to see misuse occur, so somebody's starting to misuse your identity to get a transaction account with the bank or to claim for a government service or to access your emails, increasingly people aren't aware of how they're actually getting that information. And that puts them very much on the back foot, and that puts them in a place where uncertainty reigns. And sadly, that's becoming the majority on your side of the Tasman and on this one. Telephone scams are still quite prolific. That's remained fairly consistent over the last 12 to 24 months. We've been working with telcos, and I guess the broad brush measure of volume is that on both sides of the Tasman each month, there's more than 1 million scam calls coming into the countries. So it is organised crime at large, mostly based out of the subcontinent, and using technologies that will enable them to mask and mirror and impersonate big business and big government, and they're quite expert at it. So that is a persistent threat, and sadly, another interface that we have with internal fraud and corruption has been where private sector entities have offshored call centres, and certainly in recent years, we've seen officials being corrupted within those call centres to provide such data to these organised crime groups to help enable their scam activities. We see the success of a scammer on a phone being very much similar to the success of a phisher that does spear phishing emails. So the more I know about you before I engage you, the greater the chance of success I have in deceiving you. And we certainly see that with telephone scams and emails. Emerging more prominently now, not so much on that slide, but certainly during COVID has been the use of SMS scams. So scams being received on your mobile phone. And with spoofing technology, it's quite easy for criminals to make themselves look like Inland Revenue or the Department of Internal Affairs or a major bank by sending an SMS message that mirrors that organisation's own SMS channel. And the deception there it can be quite acute because the message is effectively received in the historical legitimate communication string that you would have with that organisation. So the techniques are becoming certainly more favourable for criminals in that regard. We are also seeing worryingly convergence between relationship scams and investment scams. So where scammers aren't successful in creating a spark in terms of a relationship, they'll very quickly move to investment opportunities. And so we're seeing people fall for investment scams where the initial deception attempt was a relationship. Next slide, thanks, Kerry. We do a lot of work in measuring the conversion rate between compromise and misuse. So of all those compromise methods that you just saw before, the source of the compromise of the information, what percentage of those when they're engaging ID care then result in misuse? So quite naturally, you'll see on the right there, unknown is 100%, or it'll be very close to 100%, where people don't know what the compromise is, but they're experiencing misuse. But you'll see there's some really interesting statistics in terms of, well, what happens next? So you might be involved in a relationship or an investment scam, but then your identity and account information is further misused to either apply for a credit card or obtain a transaction account or apply for a government benefit. So it doesn't stop. And a lot of that is reflective of the response system and its agility or lack thereof. And we've seen in COVID, certainly the response system has almost ground to a halt in terms of the customer experience. A lot of the financial institutions are doing quite well and bucking that trend, but for the most part across government and other areas of industry, we've seen that response system slow dramatically. So what would typically take 20 to 24 hours, non-consecutive hours for a customer to respond to this type of event, we're now into the 40-hour on average response time frame, which takes weeks and months. And that's how we measure customer friction in this environment. Thanks, Kerry. We certainly engage through our case management work individuals who are heightened, and we do a lot of work in understanding what the psychological impacts are and the physiological impacts. So common physiological impacts for these clients will involve things like nausea, sleep deprivation or disruption, certainly sweats. Others have, in extreme cases, experienced respiratory and heart conditions. Psychological impacts very much are around anxiety and stress, in some cases leading to depression. The most acute forms that we see are relationship investment and employment scams. So they are particularly harmful to individuals. It is not uncommon for investment fraud victims to lose their life savings, and particularly at an age where they're looking to retire. So it's a very, very common scenario where we'll get someone on the phone that says, I've just lost everything I've spent my life saving, and I'm now going to be working till I die. That's a very common thing that we get. Next slide, thanks, Gary. So when we talk about risks, we really focus on, well, what is this misuse that we see? So if there's a corrupt event that exposes customer or staff details that then provides a criminal an opportunity to misuse, what does that misuse typically look like? So if we look at June so far, there's a fair amount of activity there that's focused on accessing funds. We see it very much driven by the money, but that's not the only motive. So amongst these many forms of misuse, we also see what we call deception enabling misuse. So people setting up email accounts in other people's names, social media accounts in other people's names, setting up transaction accounts in people's names to help facilitate the financial misuse that occurs. We also see identity building misuse. So people will impersonate some details to gain access to further information about that person to build out their identity credentials to commit other forms of identity misuse. And so it certainly is a crime that evolves. It is not at all static. And we find that particularly when we've been engaging organisations that are having to respond to data breach events. We find a few things. One is that incident responders like to chase risk that may not be relevant. And the other is they haven't necessarily thought through what the real risks are and how their treatment and response to those risks from a customer perspective will translate to assisting those individuals. They're very much preoccupied with BCP and getting organisations back on track. Next slide, thanks, Kerry. So here, if we just click through here a few times, Kerry, I just want to tell you a little bit about the emotional journey of individuals that are told or experience the compromise of their personal information. So the extreme left there, anxiousness or anxiety is quite high because there's a knowledge gap, and a lot of people will have that because they're not quite sure what it all means. We'll engage them, we'll talk to them about what it means, what are their options, what their response plan can look like, which will be often personalised and tailored to their circumstances. Some people in the community don't want others to know where they live for good reason. They may be survivors of family or domestic violence, or they might work for an organisation that they're concerned about a public awareness around. So that'll be a more tailored response. But as that knowledge is acquired, then the anxiety tends to reduce. But then we see this other peak happen where they're starting to engage across the response system. And that's particularly acute now. And so their frustration and anger will certainly climax. Kiwis, like Aussies, tend to get fairly switched on in this process. So what we realise is in New Zealand, like it is in Australia, the identity system, the currency that these acts are focused on acquiring, is something that government and business dictate to the consumer. I mean, our licences are there to say that we can drive a car in New Zealand and Australia, but they're also relied upon as a key evidence of identity to acquire access to products and services. It's not the consumer that's done that, the organisations impose that on the consumer. But pretty quickly for the switched on responders, they work out, well, why am I spending 30 hours having to respond to a breach that I had nothing to do with in order to ultimately protect that organisation? And it's difficult to answer that question because that's the nature of the identity systems on both sides of the Tasman. After they get over that friction, they may or may not experience things. If they don't experience things, time tends to be the healer. And they say, well, I must be all right because I haven't noticed anything. But there'll always be that lingering doubt that they don't have control of their information and it can be misused at any point in time in the future. There tend to be 4 classic responses that we will get or reactions that we get from the community, from consumers, your customers. So a lot, thankfully, will want some reassurance because there may be some doubt that what they're doing is not right. So they'll come to us as a bit of an independent body and guide. There'll be those that just want to acquire knowledge. In Australia, we call them bowerbirds. They just want to collect and collect and collect, and they find comfort in collection. You might know a few people that work like that. And then there's the paranoid souls that think that the sky's falling in and this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And they're quite heightened about the event. And there's those that want to really have a shot and want to let their frustrations loose. So typically they're the responses to the individuals that we will come across in any given day. Next slide, thanks, Kerry. That's the spaghetti bolognese of the response system. So we had a student that we sponsored here at ID Care for about 2 years. She finished up last year. She followed the journey of 211 people on both sides of the Tasman over that 2-year period. And what she learned was that the response system, next slide, Kerry, was one that on average took around 27.5 non-consecutive hours in Australia. In New Zealand, it was slightly less, it was around 24. They were consistently engaging around 8 different organisations about 20 times. The response system itself, on average, was performing around 65 to 67 tasks. So there were things that the financial institution was doing, there was things that government was doing, there was things that the victim was doing, things that we were doing. But what we found really fascinating was that of those tasks, around 2/3 were on that victim to perform. And a lot of those were repetitive. So I'll go to the police, or I'll go to my bank, or I'll go to my telco, or I'll go to a government agency and I'll be asked to fill out the same form, saying the same story, providing the same evidence of identity, and at times reliving the trauma of that particular crime. Next slide, thanks, Gary. What we see is as I mentioned, a very high dependency on that victim. And it wasn't just tasks, it was also information sharing activities. And a lot of that is a byproduct of privacy laws that we live within and operate within. The default position of a lot of organisations is we can't possibly share that information because of privacy. So the strategy and the dependency then becomes on that victim to provide consent to enable that sharing to occur. And we saw that on average of the 37 information sharing activities across that response system, again, 29 were performed by that victim, by that customer. Thanks, Kerry. So I guess to sum and round it all up from our perspective, it's a bit of a unique window on this challenge and this problem. I've been lucky enough to work for 10 years for the Australian Crime Commission. And part of that time that I had there was focused on organised crime infiltrating government agencies on this side of the Tasman. Certainly from a corruption perspective, Where we saw corruption succeed the most is where corrupting influencers would influence an employee to perform an action on behalf of the corruptor, where they didn't even know they were performing a corrupt act or enabling it. They were the ones that were most successful. We also found that culture absolutely matters, and words such as corruption and bribery and fraud were difficult in shaping that corruption environment, or the anti-corruption environment, because most employees, most people are honest. Yes, as humans we do silly things, but for the most part people are honest. And for most employees in those environments that certainly I worked within, you start talking about corruption, people go, well, that's a crime and I'm not a criminal. So it may not have much resonance. But if I talk about integrity, then we all have integrity. So we found that those types of nuances in language are important. In our world, back in ID care, what are the key takeaways for organisations is to find that equilibrium between what your organisation needs in managing that risk and what the customer requires. Where you find that balance, that's when good happens. When you don't find that balance, that's where bad happens. And that's the same for data breach response events. I think both sides of the Tasman are challenged by this nowhere customer, those that don't know how their information was compromised and is experiencing misuse. They are a very vulnerable group, and they are particularly challenged by response system behaviours. Certainly think about your risk scenarios and map out the customer journey, not just on the ideal, but on the bad and what that would look like. And fraud response friction at our end of the spectrum is measured in weeks and months, not seconds and minutes. So thanks again for the opportunity to have a chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you, David. Again, very interesting presentation. And I think anyone who's worked in law enforcement particularly will really resonate with your comments around the devastating effect that fraud has on people, particularly when there's a large financial loss. Absolutely devastating for someone to perhaps reach the latter of their working years and to find that everything they thought they'd worked for has gone. And trying to support them through that process is no easy task. So I think we all appreciate what you're doing with your organisation. We're going to move into the Q&A session now. And as Teresa said at in her introduction, if you have any questions that you'd like to put to our panellists, please use the Q&A function or the chat function on Teams, and hopefully they'll pop up on my screen, and I'll be able to put those to the panellists as we go. But I think we'll start with the first question, perhaps with Graham. You did talk a wee bit in your presentation about the things that organisations can do to promote a healthy culture around fraud and corruption. But so if you were going to pick your top 2 or 3 things that an organisation can either put in place or can actually do, what would they be?
Well, look, there are probably more than 2 or 3 things to focus on to achieve this. 3, I guess, fairly non-controversial things: having executive support and messaging about the organisation taking fraud and corruption seriously, clear and transparent business processes that everyone knows about and follow, and importantly that employees hold each other to account about, and lastly, transparency of what happens when a report or when someone doesn't follow a process occurs. People see actually something happening so that they know that the organisation actually lives and breathes it. I would just touch on what David said is the discussion is easier to have around integrity rather than corruption, because people do understand integrity, whereas, as you say, corruption is a crime and it's hard to, everyone thinks they're not a criminal. But I think also one important thing is take the opportunity to recognise that catching fraud is actually a good thing. If you're not finding it, really you're not looking for it. And in the UK, they celebrate when they find fraud because actually it's a good thing, it's not a negative.
lost you there for the last second there, Graham, but yeah, thank you for that. I wonder too, putting your HR hat on, you often see organisations who have that conflict between wanting to make public the results of a fraud investigation involving an employee particularly, but obviously on the other hand, not being able to say too much because of those considerations around employees. Have you got any advice on that?
Well, I think a lot of organisations get confused and they allow one or the other, area or function to lead. I'd say we've seen a number of times that the integrity team reports to the head of HR because it's seen as a people thing. I think that's I think that's a possible failing and the cause for problems. Look, it's quite possible to take effective investigative action and take HR action at the same time. You just need to work your way through it. If we come in to investigate, for example, there's nothing to stop an organisation following the action they need to take, to get rid of the person, or take disciplinary action. And I would just mirror, I think, what Campbell said is, if there's a fraud, report it. It's up to the enforcement agency whether they take action, but report it. We see fraudsters popping up left, right, and centre after they've committed a fraud somewhere, and everyone says, "Oh, didn't you know they were a fraudster? They were booted out of somewhere for committing fraud." The only way to fix that is to report to law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, thank you. Campbell, if we into you. With regard to investigating cyber fraud, sort of looking back over your time with PwC and your own business, what have been some of the biggest failings you've seen in organisations during the process of their own sort of internal investigation before they refer the matter to you?
Sure. I'm going to go back even further, actually, and when I first learned about forensics and evidence handling, and I learned about Lockhart's principle, and that every contact leaves a trace. I was sent out to work with some senior crime officers in South Auckland, and unfortunately, it was a rainy day, and I learned about it's very difficult to lift fingerprints when it's been raining on the windows and stuff. So same thing with cybercrime. Look, every contact leaves a trace, but in order to leave that trace, you have to firstly enable logging for those traces to occur. So what I'm seeing at the moment is people are jumping onto the cloud. They're signing up to cloud-based email systems, but they're going for the cheap plans. And while that may not be an issue, generally the cheap plans, A, don't have the same protections, and B, it doesn't log the same amount of data. Now, I've mentioned before about Reconnaissance, and these people can be on your network for a week, 3 months, or a year. If you're a victim of a business email compromise and you need to go and work out which emails have been accessed, these systems do have the ability to record line by line which emails have been opened. If you've turned on the logging from the outset and you then go back and look at those logs, you can determine which emails the attackers have actually viewed. Therefore, when it comes to notification, bearing in mind also there's another whole side topic around Privacy Act changes and mandatory notification, which I won't go into, but you're far better placed to be able to say, hand on heart, these are the emails in our customers whose details have been compromised. So it all falls back to turning on the logging from the outset, and when a cybercrime does happen, is actually acting quickly, thinking about the value of that evidence, preserving it. You don't have to examine it, and David talked about incident responders going after potential risks that aren't actually there. Well, the good thing is at least, and I agree with that, the good thing is that at least if you've got a data source preserved, if you do need to look at it afterwards, and if the police or the SFO want to look at that, you can hand them over that data.
Yeah, good advice. So perhaps back to Graham or David, along the same lines, is there anything that you would add to that if we were looking at the more traditional types of fraud as opposed to cyber?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say start having a conversation with the law enforcement agency early. Don't wait too long. Or engage a CA firm. There you go. I've got a pumpkin for you. It's about engaging early and understanding what you can and can't do, what you should and shouldn't do. Look, we're quite happy to have conversations with organisations who want to know what they should do, or whether it's a fraud or a corruption or whatever. And it's much better to have that conversation early rather than later, where you've put in place a number of things, you've destroyed evidence, you've alerted the suspect. Makes life a lot harder for yourself and a law enforcement agency later on.
Is there anything, David, you'd add to that?
Yeah, I might add a few things. One is probably reflect upon what your employment contracts and policies are now, to see what scope you have in collecting information and undertaking an initial triage of what's occurred. It is difficult, having been involved in situations where there's a tip-off involving a staff member about, for example, their boss, and an investigation is on foot to then be the manager of that manager and know how you're going to treat that and manage that process. It's certainly been a challenge on this side of the Tasman, where we've had the equivalent of an SFO engage or start to investigate, and these are complex cases. Corruption is acutely complex, because ultimately those that are alleged of being involved in corrupt conduct will have an inside knowledge of the controls that the organisation has. So invariably investigations can take a long time. So the treatment and management of not just the whistleblower, but also the subject of that investigation can be really complex, and working through that ahead of time and those scenarios is really important for organisations to it's not something you want to make up as you go. You want to have something to fall back on that you've considered, where you've had time to consider it.
I think one thing you said, Graham, earlier is to report fraud. And I'll probably just reiterate too that SFOs are probably a good place to start with, whether you would agree. Perhaps slightly easier to find the right person at SFO to talk to rather than going through the police. And that even if the fraud doesn't end up with the SFO as being the most appropriate agency, you'd certainly be a good sounding board, and quite happy to refer people on to police or Comcom or anywhere else that was perhaps more appropriate.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, we kind of take fraud personally, and so we want to see action happen. And as recently as last week, I tracked down the relevant detective in Counties Manukau that a government department needed to refer a fraud to, so that it actually found the right home. So we do that regularly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat of a question I often get asked is, what fits the SFO criteria? Should we go to SFO? And so the answer I give people is, well, yes, because if it doesn't fit the criteria, they'll tell you, and they'll tell you where to take it anyway. David, turning to you, a question. Do you think we do enough to protect the victims of fraud? Is there an organisation that you can use as an example that does it well?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what aspect of that fraud cycle, if you like, we're talking about. I think there's the initial blush that we just spoke about, where there is an allegation of a corrupt act or a fraud action, and the treatment of the person who is alleged or accused, and of the staff that may have either alleged it or be impacted by the alleged event. Those that tend to do that well are those that have already war-gamed that scenario and have a playbook and are quite clear on their actions. Having wind in your sails and having a process done that's thorough but also timely can be a blessing. In terms of the aftermath, there's a few things, and I think Graham touched on this before, is not kind of celebrating that you've had a fraud, but taking the opportunity to learn from that as an organisation. And being communicative about what had occurred, what unfolded, and what changes the organisation maturely wants to make around that event, I think is a way of which organisations can show leadership and a tone from the top. The victims themselves, look, it is a challenging space, particularly where personal information and credential and account information may well be part of the offending. The system is not a good one, the response system on either side of the Tasman. It's one that's still maturing and one that's very much beholden on what an individual organisation will require a customer or employee to do, and therein lies the friction. You know, I think when we measure performance, we ask our clients, your customers, what their experience has been like in navigating the response system. That gives us a really good bead on who's naughty and who's nice in terms of responding to these things. And pleasingly, I think as much as there's a degree of, you know, let's go after the banks with these things, and there's a good front page news story about this, they're performing quite well, you know, on both sides of the Tasman. They're doing things that acknowledge that the individual has a much broader risk that they have to manage beyond the boundary of an organisation. And other organisations can learn from that acknowledgement, and that's where I was, I guess, getting to, is to find that equilibrium between what you and your organisation needs to achieve and what the individual's up against.
Thank you. Campbell, and perhaps Graham, from a slightly different angle, if we were going to talk about controls that we could put in place, particularly around accounting controls in the space of procurement fraud, could you give us some suggestions on the top controls that should be in place?
Happy to go first. So I'll draw on those stats that I had earlier around obviously tip-offs, so encouraging people to do so. Also, again, just drawing on what I mentioned before around training your staff around financial control procedures. So there's some great resource out there. It's free resource from, for example, CAMS and cyber and the finance function, for example. That would be a couple from me. Graham?
Yeah, look, I've touched on a little bit of this, but I'd say tight and effective contracts, clearly spelling out obligations, deliverables, you know, audit and reporting requirements. Essentially, when you create your contract plan for failure, whatever that might be, you know, think about, well, actually what could go wrong, rather than live on cloud nine and think everything will be perfect. So, yeah, audit, determine conflicts of interests, really understand them, and have effective processes to exclude them from having an impact on your organisation.
Campbell, turning back to you, cyber-related frauds, obviously everyday occurrences in New Zealand. If staff are the sort of first line of defence, what techniques have you seen that have been effective in terms of training staff on how to spot or prevent fraud?
Thanks. So been working in this for 20 years now, and really there's been a big shift in the last 5 years, I think. And in New Zealand that came, one of the first government initiatives was the Connect Smart, which led to the Cyber Awareness Weeks, which fell in line with the global initiatives as well. There's a massive number of people in New Zealand who do great work in and around this area, and they work hard behind the scenes at doing what they can to protect the systems. But yeah, staff are one of the first lines of defence. So recent initiatives from CertNZ have been fantastic as well, posters, so on and so forth. I had the pleasure of undertaking a pretty large, being part of a large cyber awareness campaign, which was a game. It was a gamification. And essentially we did 12 rounds like a boxing match. The executives and board and various staff members would be the attackers, and then half of them would be the defenders. And at the end of 12 rounds, you'd always hear at the end of it, I didn't quite appreciate that the IT people had to get it right all of the time. It only takes one act by an attacker to get through our defences, and we've suffered a loss. And the greatest thing that we see out the back of that is typically an increase in funding towards both the technological process, but also, of course, in the staff awareness and training as well. So I mentioned before, and I'd say it again, for every dollar spent on cyber security, I think it's well spent that 80 cents of that goes towards training your people.
Thank you. David, have you seen a change in the way organisations manage breaches since the change in the Privacy Act in Australia, with the requirement of mandatory reporting or expectations from GDPR?
Yeah, there was I guess prior to the legislation coming into effect in Australia, I guess it's the period you're in New Zealand at the moment, organisations were wanting to follow what they anticipate was the legislation in advance, so probably 12 to 18 months out. Given the bill's exposure, we were seeing organisations start to, I guess, mirror or conduct compliance in a way that that would be the case when the legislation was in play. We still see some fundamental mistakes being made. So I guess we've had over 1,000 battle scars now since 2013 with data breaches on both sides of the Tasman, and some of the fundamental errors, I think, is coming to fore in environments where criminals are increasingly gaining access, threatening exposure of data. Organisations are feeling pressured to either pay a ransom or come clean. They don't quite know what information's been exposed. In notifying people, they don't quite know what to tell them. That in effect is causing harm to people that are being notified. So that's still a pretty messy environment, and I don't think organisations have really got that down pat. We're very much of a fundamental view that individuals, wherever possible, should be told precisely what classes of information has been exposed. Incident responders tend to not think that their incident response continues after they pack up their bags. When they notify, that's when the real incident response occurs. And for most impacted people, that will take months. So I think that's a pretty key lesson that we've learned over the last 6 years in working with incidents. The response system and knowledge of the response system is also pretty weak. So what is actually available out there to help people that have had their information compromised is something that's either not considered in the notification, which is a failing, or they're recommending measures that individuals can't pursue, or there's no point in pursuing. So that's a critical piece of knowledge that organisations need that we're not seeing a good, strong grasp of on both sides of the Tasman. And so leading into your change in legislation, I'd certainly behove organisations to get across that.
Okay. And a follow-up question. With the staff in organisations who sort of on the front line of handling these sort of breaches, dealing with their customers who have lost, obviously can have a sort of psychological effect on those staff who are doing that, particularly if it's happening on a daily basis or repetitive basis.
Yeah.
Within your own team, how do you support your staff who obviously this is their what they do all day, every day?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we have daily debriefs and weekly debriefs with staff. So it's not uncommon for our case managers to be exposed to just one crisis after the next, and that's their day. So we've done a few things. We've narrowed the shifts, so we don't want an 8-hour exposure to that type of environment. So they're short, sharp shifts. We do have supervision and debriefing of those. Everyone has their own triggers as to what gets them going and what can impact them emotionally. We also lean heavily on an external psychological support service. So we're conscious that even though we have qualified counsellors and social workers and psychologists, that we don't cross the line there. We give staff an alternative, independent, anonymous, confidential service to go to. we're pretty clued into what triggers some of our staff members and what gets them going. So we're supervising and managing the distribution of the caseload also accordingly. So we try our very best to ensure that staff don't spend 5 hours straight talking to 10 relationship scam victims, as an example. But we're a cog in a much bigger response wheel. I mean, our role in that wheel is to provide a central point for that person to come to work out how they navigate this system. So we extend our services to members of banks and telcos and government who are equally exposed, that might want to talk to our counsellors about anonymously their experience and how they've managed and engaged a fraud victim that may not even be convinced they're a fraud victim, and what are the strategies around that type of engagement. We think that care is something that's really needed across the system, as well as the victim care.
All right. We'll have some of the questions from the floor. They're not popping up on my screen, so I'll actually pass to Kerry, and I'll just ask her if she can run through a few of those questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we've got a couple of questions from the floor, as stated. So I'm just going to read them out. Graham, the first one's for you. Recently, I've seen the focus on pre-qualifying agents change, so that the assumption is that they are corrupt and business have to prove that they aren't in order to use them. In the SFO's experience, what level of corruption are you seeing in foreign agents that is not being captured by businesses?
Yeah, look, I'm a little bit unclear what industry talking about there. Look, I mean, I think it's a challenging area, because I can't think you can enter into engaging with people on the assumption that they're corrupt to start with, or that a particular demographic or culture is corrupt. So I think that is quite challenging. But, I guess equally in different environments and industries, you do have to be more alert to the risk. But I can't really take it any more than that, really, without understanding a little bit more specifics.
Sure, that's fine. The question was from Emma. If you want to send me more details, I can definitely forward that on to Graham to provide more content, if that is suitable. The next question, some organizations choose not to share internal fraud or corruption incidences within their own organization. This could be due to not wanting to expose certain departments, staff, etc. But how healthy is this approach, or damaging this is this approach? In New Zealand, we normally have a mindset that it will not happen here in New Zealand. Educating and sharing and being transparent is very important, and I don't believe we are communicating on this adequately. Campbell, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, and I'll repeat it again, which is I think that all instances of potential crime should be referred to the appropriate agency to deal with it. Something I've seen over the years has been employment of individuals where, for example, pre-employment checks are either not conducted at all, or they're conducted and the previous history doesn't come up. So I think everyone's got the right to be informed about incidents. There was a case yesterday in the newspaper about someone who took $45,000, I think it was, from their employer, and the judge mentioned that this person was a recidivist, had offended 15 odd years ago, and he basically said to him, this is your last warning. So, future's employer of that person, I think it's very handy to have that information to hand.
Perfect. So our next question from Hetzel. Despite all procedures being in place, I think, Campbell, this is probably still your question. Despite all procedures being in place, there are still crimes and frauds that happen. Obviously, this is a post-event realization, but do you see organizations appreciating or realizing the importance of insurance as a part of risk management process? From your experience, how many of the organizations you come across have crime and or cyber cover, say as a percentage?
Great question, and I saw cyber really picking up probably about 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, give or take, before New Zealand insurance companies started offering it. And this came from one of my colleagues in the UK. And so I started talking to some of the the insurance litigators about whether or not there was a future in New Zealand of this. Quite quickly, there's a large number of insurers who offer such policies. I'd say more have the crime cover than the cyber cover, but they're designed to cover two different things. So I'd certainly let the insurance companies talk to what their own policies cover, but in my experience, cyber is designed to get over the immediate event and get the company working again whilst reducing the risk or mitigating the risk of a recurrence. It's one thing to lose some money, and that's terrible, but it's a whole different kettle of fish when it comes to a data breach. So regarding percentages, no, can't talk to that. But I think a lot of New Zealand organisations, we're 96% made up of SMEs. I think it's good value for money to have a policy. Should you have an incident, the alternative, of course, is you spend a lot of money on prevention, hope nothing happens. I guess you can liken it to those who choose to have medical insurance versus those that don't.
Perfect. Final question from the floor. And I think this is directed at you, Graham. So just curious, why NZSAR suspicious activity reports, data cannot be shared cross-border? Wouldn't this help other countries and intelligence agencies go after potential criminals efficiently and share intelligence?
Yeah, okay, well, that's something managed by the police financial intelligence unit, so I can't say I'm an expert on it, but my understanding is that it can be shared on a case-by-case situation through the Egmont Group, which is a collection of all the FIUs. If you're talking about some kind of holistic database in which all STRs or SARs are stored and any agency in any country can dip into them, I really can't comment on that. I think I could see some problems straight away, but it might catch some fraudsters, I guess, and criminals. Yeah.
That's all from the floor. Over back to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Just a couple more questions here from me. Campbell, do you think as a country we are prepared sufficiently to protect ourselves against cybercrime? Do we have the awareness? Are we resourced, particularly in the public sector, are we sufficiently resourced to deal with the amount of cybercrime coming in?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and it's hard, right? It's hard for a couple of different reasons. One is there's a lot of agile development going on right now, which is fantastic. We're enabling new business by creating new technologies, and I absolutely love helping organisations in that journey that they go through. But I'm kind of like the glass half full guy, where I'm saying, talk about the risks, talk about the risks. But if you look at Europe, GDPR, it's all about security by design now. People are getting into the right mindset where we know, especially with Internet of Things and everything's all connected these days, you need to have better security in place. So the key thing being, as long as people throughout the organisation are aware of the risks and they're dealing with it as much as possible, I think New Zealand is in a good place. I think we've been doing a lot over many, many years, and it continues to get better. The thing is, you just can't take your eye off the ball. As I said earlier, the criminals, they only need one chance to get through your defences, and that could be a threat to your existence. A company could technically go under, a government department could face some pretty severe reputational issues for a while. But the great thing is there's a massive ecosystem of experts out there who are always trying to do better. So if you feel like you're not doing enough, talk to your IT people, talk to your security people, and just ask yourself the question, where are we at? What more do we need to do? You might be surprised in that it's not going to cost you as much as what you otherwise might think.
Right. My last question, Graham, and I think this is probably quite relevant to some of the media commentary in the last couple of days out of the PIF report that you mentioned. New Zealand's widely recognised as being one of the least corrupt countries in the world. which raises the question of whether that's because we don't have corruption or whether we don't look for corruption, as I guess part one of the question. But do you think that our psyche of thinking that corruption doesn't exist here is actually a downfall?
Every time. Look, I think in a word, probably yes. As a nation, we're generally trusting and honest. Our small population and isolation means we tend to be complacent regarding overseas threats. Naive about their impact, adversely on our culture and way of doing business. And I think, there's a tendency to look at the Transparency International Index and say, look, we're number 1, 2, or 3, so we're exceptional. And I think that flows through into other areas. I think there's a degree of kind of exceptionalism kind of flowing into our response to COVID-19, and we think we're marvellous, but I think that's a little bit of a national trait. However, I think there was one of the questions around that came from the floor around, do we keep things quiet? We think it's not the New Zealand way, and I think that question reflects the downside of the fact that actually, we are a bit naive, we are a bit complacent, we think we are different. Look, we're not. We're part of the world. We face the same risks that everyone else do, slightly smaller scale. We're not that different. We just have to be open and honest and make sure that everyone understands the risks, and we put in place building blocks to protect ourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Look, that's all the questions that we have from me for the Q&A session, unless any more have come in from the floor for Kerry. But thank you very much to our 3 speakers. It's been, I think, a very informative session. Quite enjoyed. I'll hand back to Kerry just to wrap up.
Thanks everybody for attending today's webinar. Hope that you have garnered some insights and some learnings. A special shout out to Kpmg for supporting and being a huge sponsor of RIMS. Thank you to our fabulous panelists and Matt for moderating. Thanks everybody for attending the session today, and look out for the invite for the Global Megatrends session scheduled for July. Have a fantastic day. Thanks everybody. Cheers, bye.
Thank you.